Imagine a battlefield. Dust, blood, screams. In the center of the formation, a figure standing out even among battle-hardened warriors. On his helmet, over bronze and iron, human bones gleam white. This is not decoration, not superstition for beauty's sake. This is a sign that was meant to instill terror in enemies and remind his own soldiers that death is near and that the centurion had already looked it straight in the eyes. But why did Roman commanders decorate their helmets with human remains? And what dark message was hidden in this ritual understood only by legion veterans? The answer to this question overturns our understanding of Rome, and if you watch to the end you will understand this tradition was not simply part of war, it was a personal oath taken by men who had passed through hell. Ancient authors such as Tacitus and Polybius wrote that centurions were not simply officers, they were living symbols of discipline. These men were placed in the front ranks. Their duty was to hold the line and set an example. But the longer campaigns lasted, the more centurions became half men, half shadows of death. Warriors, whose faces were covered with sweat, dust and dried blood, called such commanders guardians of the threshold. Their term for this, centurio, meant a man who commanded 100, but in reality he commanded not only men, but their fear as well. Imagine a formation 1,000 paces long where everyone knows, if order collapses, the entire legion will perish. In this silence rang out a metallic sound. The centurion struck his vine stick, a wooden rod of authority. It was called vitis, and with it he had the right to beat his soldiers. This was not simply a symbol of power, this was a rhythm, a sound that pierced the silence like the drumbeat of the army's heart. But the most terrifying thing, the helmets. Archaeologists have found depictions, and sometimes the finds themselves, where bones were attached over Roman helmets, most often skull fragments or jawbones. Historians debate whether they belonged to enemies or former comrades, but one thing is clear, this was a sign that the centurion had crossed a boundary from which there is no return. Think about this. Today athletes wear medals, soldiers receive awards and patches, but in ancient Rome the most terrible symbol of service could be a fragment of human bone on a helmet. This is as if a commander of a modern army wore on his helmet part of a shell that had once hit him. Excavations in North Africa and on the Germanic frontier have shown such decorations were not mass-produced. This was the choice of veterans who had gone through dozens of campaigns. Those whose hearts no longer beat in unison with ordinary people. And here arises the question, what forced these officers to turn their helmet into a reminder of death? Lust for power? Psychological trauma? Or was this an ancient way to show, I have already survived death, and therefore I am immortal? The answer is hidden in the very system of the Roman army, and to understand it, one needs to look deeper into the life, training and merciless rules by which centurions lived. To understand why bones and body fragments became part of Roman centurions' equipment, one needs to see how their lives were formed in general, before the moment when they became veterans. A centurion is not simply a commander, but a face that a soldier saw every day. Unlike a legate or tribune, who more often kept their distance and gave strategic orders, a centurion lived alongside the legionaries, ate the same bread and made the same marches. But at the same time, he was the one responsible for the iron discipline that distinguished Roman forces from all others. Caesar wrote that centurions were chosen not so much for bravery as for strength of spirit and the ability to maintain order in formation. The word centuria means a unit of approximately 80 men, but it was not the number that made it terrifying, but the fact that each of these men was daily bound by a blood oath to the officer. And the centurion carried a sign of authority, a staff called vita. With this staff, he could beat subordinates for the slightest violation. To modern ears, this sounds cruel, but for Romans, the vita was a symbol that order stood above life. Imagine the scene. A column marches through hot Spain. Stones cut feet. Pack animals fall. But the centurion with bone decoration on his helmet walks ahead. For soldiers, this is a reminder. If he could endure pain and returned alive, then the rest must too. A centurion's equipment was heavier than that of an ordinary legionary. Archaeological data shows that a full set of armor, shield and weapons could weigh more than 25 kilograms. Add to these rations, according to Polybius, a soldier daily received wheat, meat, wine and cheese, totaling up to 1.5 kilograms of provisions, which he himself carried on the march. Multiply this by the dozens of kilometers that the legion covered per day, and you will understand that logistics itself was a feat. But the centurion had not only to walk and carry equipment, he was the first in formation to enter battle. Romans had a practice of intimidating enemies through demonstrative actions. Livy mentioned that after victory over the Gauls, warriors decorated their armor with parts of enemy equipment, but it was veteran centurions who sometimes made this step even darker. They left enemy bones on their helmets. For enemies, this was a curse, for subordinates, a sign that their commander had already experienced death and conquered it. Here it is important to recall the term that reflects the very essence of this practice, spolia. This is what Romans called military trophies taken from the enemy. These could be weapons, armor, or even body parts. For the legion, spolia were not simply spoils, but proof of power. The image becomes even stronger if you imagine a night camp. Torches burn, shadows dance across tents, and the centurion sits, polishing his helmet with its bone trophy. Soldiers look at him and understand. This man is a living symbol of their fear and their hope. Historians differ in their assessments. Some claim that such decorations were worn only during rituals or parades. Others believe they appeared on the battlefield as well, when the centurion wanted to show enemies. He is not afraid of blood. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. But one thing is known for certain. Such details made the image of a Roman officer terrifying and unforgettable. And here arises the next question. If even the centurion's appearance carried threat and memory of death, then what did the actual beginning of battle look like, where such men went out ahead of everyone? It is there that the true role of these bone symbols is revealed. Imagine dawn. Cold morning mist over the river. Fog spreads between trees. The legion prepares for battle. At first, only the creak of leather and dull clank of metal can be heard, but then over the silence rings out the piercing sound of a trumpet, the signal to form up. At this moment, every soldier knows. The centurion will go ahead. Not the legate, not the tribune, but he, the man with bone trophy on his helmet, will become the first figure in the attack line. Romans employed a formation that resembled a wall, a dense front of warriors capable of crushing the enemy step by step. This formation was called acies, that is, the battle line. For legionaries, acies meant something simple. You have no right to retreat, because your neighbor's shoulder and the strike of his shield hold you in formation. And it was precisely the centurion who ensured that no one wavered. An image of terror and inspiration in one person. His helmet with bones reflects the first rays of sun, and in his hands, the vita, staff of authority. He shouts commands, and the legion comes alive like a huge beast. For soldiers, this is not simply an officer, this is a totem, a living symbol that death is near, but it can be conquered. Facts about the column's movement order are striking in their precision. Each legion was divided into cohorts, and each cohort into centuries. During marches, the centurion walked either ahead of his unit or alongside the first rank. The column could stretch for several kilometers, but everything was held together precisely by these officers. Polybius noted that Roman order amazed enemies. While Gauls or Germans moved chaotically, the legion remained a machine in which each part knew its place. Imagine a soldier's tension. He sees that an enemy awaits ahead, hears the battle roar of the opponent, and at this moment his gaze catches on the bone sign on his commander's helmet. This could be a jaw fragment or piece of rib, dried and polished by time. For the enemy, an abomination. For the Roman, an oath. He thinks, if my centurion survived this and returned, then I too can pass through this hell. Sources mention that centurions were first to rush into battle. Caesar wrote that they carried legionaries along by their example and often took the first blow upon themselves. And in this lies the explanation of the strange bone trophies. This is not decoration for cruelty's sake. This is psychological warfare. Every enemy seeing bone on a helmet understood. Before him stands not simply a man, but one who had already looked death in the face and uses it as a banner. Here it is important to introduce another term, signum. This was a unit's sign, a metal standard that soldiers guarded with their lives. To lose a signum was considered disgrace, but in real battle, far more often than at the banner, soldiers looked at their centurion. His helmet and bone trophies became a personal signum. As long as he lives and moves forward, the century holds. Archaeological finds confirm this cult of image. In places of major battles, such as the Teutoburg forest, scientists have found armor remains with unusual mounting traces, as if additional objects had been screwed onto them. Perhaps these were those very bones. Historians debate whether they were real remains or imitations made of wood and metal, but the essence does not change. The psychological effect worked. The image becomes almost cinematic. The first strike, shields clash, spears break, enemy cries, and the crash of metal. In this mid-grinder, the centurion moves forward, and his bone sign gleams in the dawn light. This is like a lightning flash amid smoke, frightening and inspiring simultaneously. But what happened when battle turned to chaos, when formation broke and death broke free from control? It was precisely in such moments that the dark truth about veterans was revealed, and why bones remained with them even after battle. Imagine the field after battle. The sun sets, air is thick with smoke and the smell of blood. Earth is strewn with bodies, and silence gives way to cries of the wounded. It was here that the dark tradition was born, about which ancient authors spoke restrainedly, but which shocks us today. Veteran centurions left signs of their victory on the battlefield, turning enemy death into trophy. Tacitus wrote that Germans revered human heads as sacred gifts to gods, and Romans, encountering this, adopted some elements. But if for barbarians a skull was an object of cult, then for a Roman centurion this was a personal sign of survival. He took bone not for prayer, but as a reminder he had again returned from hell. Such a trophy was called spolia opima, the highest gifts taken from the enemy. In classical understanding, this was armor of a killed leader, but in popular memory the concept expanded. For a centurion, any sign torn from death's hands could become spolia. In this lies the terrifying symbolism. Bones became documents of victory. Imagine the scene. A veteran sits by the fire. In his hands is a rib fragment, boiled and bleached white like stone. He attaches it to his helmet. For us, this is savagery. For him, a way to capture the moment when he alone broke through enemy lines. This is not decoration. This is biography written in blood. Modern historians, such as Goldsworthy, note, Romans were pragmatists. They did not strive for mysticism's sake, but knew that symbols influence people. Bone decorations could raise legionaries' fighting spirit and simultaneously intimidate enemies. In conditions where armies met in hand-to-hand combat, psychological advantage was no less important than iron. And now imagine the chaos of battle. Formation breaks, warriors mix together, screams drown out commands. The centurion remains the last island of order. His figure towers above, and the helmet with bone trophy becomes a beacon in the storm. Soldiers, seeing this sign, gather around him again, like children around a fire. This works as a primitive but powerful psychological magnet. But behind this heroic image lies dark truth. Veterans who survived dozens of campaigns returned to Rome as broken men. Plutarch wrote of silent warriors who had seen too much. Some of them brought home their bone trophies, kept them in houses, turned them into amulets. For modern men this sounds like madness, but for them this was continuation of service. It is important to recall another term, disciplina militaris. This is not simply military discipline, this is a cult of order to which everything submitted. Bone on helmet is merely extreme manifestation of this discipline, a symbol that man had subordinated even death to his will. Archaeology confirms, in military camps they found bones, processed and adapted for wearing. Perhaps these were sacrificial objects, perhaps precisely trophies. But the fact is that Roman soldiers lived among reminders of death. This was their way of coping with war's nightmare. The image of camp after battle is mesmerizing. Some Polish weapons, other street wounds, and somewhere a veteran carefully attaches a new fragment to his helmet. He is silent, but his action speaks louder than any words. I survived this. I am stronger than death. And here arises the main question. If each bone sign is a trace of past battle, then what happens to a person when these signs become too many? After all, one cannot constantly wear death on one's head and remain the same. Imagine an old veteran who returned to Rome after dozens of campaigns. His body is covered with scars, his gait heavy, shoulders stooped from years of wearing armor. But most importantly, bone trophies hang on his helmet, like a living list of all deaths he had survived. For city inhabitants, this was both terror and admiration. Before them stood a man who not only served, but literally carried with him memory of every battle. Sources speak of veterans often returning not as they were remembered. Livy wrote that soldiers accustomed to war found no joy in peaceful life. Their gaze was heavy, and their habits strange. Bones they brought home became part of their daily life, hung in house atriums, stored alongside family relics. For modern men, this would look like a symbol of trauma, but for a Roman, this was proof of courage. Such attitude arose from a special Roman tradition, the cult of ancestral memory. Masks of dead relatives, wax faces, were displayed during funeral processions. Every Roman from childhood saw before him features of long-dead ancestors. Therefore, enemy bone on helmet did not seem monstrous. This was merely continuation of a world where death is always near. The term important here is imbrex, funeral mask. This is a symbol of ancestral memory. As family preserved faces of their ancestors, so centurion preserved enemy bones, a sign of his personal history. The difference is only that family gave him past, while war, present. Imagine the scene, a crowd on the forum. Young men look at an old centurion, and their gazes are full of a mixture of fear and respect. For them, he is a living legend, but for the veteran himself, this is burden. Each bone reminds him that he lost friends, saw subordinates perish, and himself repeatedly cheated death. These trophies become his shield from oblivion, but also his curse. Modern researchers note that veterans often developed signs of what we would call psychological trauma. Goldsworthy wrote that constant presence of death broke people and only brutal discipline allowed them to remain in formation. Bone trophies can be viewed as symbol of this breakdown. Soldier transformed horror into sign of strength so as not to drown in pain himself. Archaeological finds in Rome's vicinity show that in veteran burials strange objects were sometimes found, bones inserted into sword sheaths or attached to armor. This confirms the habit of preserving such things did not disappear even after end of service. It became part of their personality, part of their memory. And now, ask yourself the question, is it possible to live if your memory is always on your helmet? Veterans whose helmets were decorated with bones seemed to voluntarily choose eternal companionship with war. For them, peace was never silence, every sound reminded of battle cries, every hand movement of combat. The image becomes especially vivid at moment of triumph celebration. Emperor enters Rome, legionaries march behind him, and among them centurions with bone trophies. Crowd rejoices, children throw flowers, but alongside flowers, white bone fragments gleam. This is parade of victors, but also parade of shadows. And here an open loop arises. If even after triumph centurions did not remove their grim signs, then this was not simply decoration. This was reminder that war never lets go. But then, what happened to Rome itself, when thousands of such men returned home, bringing with them trophies of death? This is precisely what will become key to story's resolution. Imagine Rome at end of 1st century. Forums bustle, markets are full of people, children run between columns. But in crowd, one can increasingly meet veterans, stern, silent, with eyes that reflect not urban bustle, but ashes of battles. Their helmets, sometimes decorated with bone fragments, became mute reminder. This world rests on shoulders of people who had seen too much. Tacitus wrote that veterans brought to city fear and memory of war. For society, this was twofold. On one hand, pride in warriors, on other, anxiety. After all, each such man carried death within him, and with it, new habits. And these habits gradually changed Roman Empire itself. Here it is important to recall a term that shows depth of changes: veteran colony. These are settlements where former soldiers were sent. They were given land, houses, but along with them, their trophies, their habit of living among bones and weapons arrived there too. Archaeological excavations in such colonies show that military artifacts, including processed bones, were found even in daily life. This means that memory of war continued to live with them, influencing new generations. Imagine the scene: a boy plays by a veteran's house. In his hands, not a toy, but a small bone fragment that once decorated a centurion's helmet. For him, this is not horror, but ordinary part of the world. Thus, war's fear became commonplace, passed from elders to younger ones. Modern historians emphasize, Romans were unique in that they knew how to transform personal trauma into state power. Bone on centurion's helmet is simultaneously both private pain and political instrument. It instilled terror in enemies, disciplined legionaries, and reminded citizens of imperial might's price. But the dark truth is that such symbols destroyed the bearers themselves. Veteran could not rid himself of his trophies, because without them he felt empty. Bone became his biography, his passport, his voice, and in this lay tragedy. To prove strength, one had to daily carry death with oneself. The image of finale is especially vivid if one imagines archaeological finds. In some centurions' tombs, alongside weapons they found human bones. This means that even after death, they did not release their trophies. For them, this was bridge to eternity, sign that they had not lived life in vain. And now the most important thing, remember the question at beginning? Why did Roman centurions wear bones on helmets? Because they transformed death into symbol of strength. Because in their world, to live meant daily conquering horror. Because without these bones, they would remain simply men. But with them, they became legends. And here is question personally to you. If you had to go through dozens of battles, lose friends and drag war's burden upon yourself, could you live with memory that always gleams above your head? Rome fell after centuries, but its legacy lives. Modern armies also know price of symbols, awards, patches, orders, all this is echo of ancient trophies. Only Romans went further, they took death itself as witness. And so the dark truth is simple. Bones on helmets, this is not savagery, this is formula of Roman spirit. Transform horror into strength, death into weapon, and personal trauma into history. And now each of us can ask ourselves, does even shadow of that iron will remain in us, which allowed simple people to become immortal symbols of empire?